Hello, friends. Welcome to the Merry Corncrakes podcast, the official podcast for the Corncrake magazine. Now, the Corncrake magazine, it is simply marvelous. It publishes every month a digital magazine with stories from classic authors like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, Charles Dickens, and recent authors working today, independent authors who are online, who are publishing new and exciting and fresh stories which engage with the English literary tradition. If that sounds like something that interests you, go over to thecorncrakemag.com and you can read this month's issue. And today I am delighted to welcome a guest on who is a great supporter of the Corncrake magazine, and he's written an article recently which really piqued my imagination. And so I wanted to discuss it with him. It is none other than King Emperor Penguin. Hello, Penguin. How are you doing?
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I'm doing very well, thank you, Nathan. And yourself?
I'm doing splendid. As you can see, it is summer. I'm embracing the summer, the British summer, or even though it is grey clouds outside, I'm committed to wearing a summer outfit when I can. So I'm in a good mood, and I'm extra excited to talk about your article, which, as I understand it, it was in response to a post that Isaac Young, who's been on the Corncrake podcast, had written about. So could you tell us a little bit about what kind of motivated you to write this article?
Of course. Well, I'm a mutual of Isaac, and I have a great deal of respect for him, his work, and his thoughts, and his spicy Twitter threads, of course. And often with Twitter, I just like to sit on the sidelines and be a lurker, which is not very wholesome, but it stops me from getting addicted to social media too much. And I saw his thread essentially about basically how the mainstream right wing moneyed complex, like the conservative right wing, especially in America, has dropped the ball in terms of patronage, supporting artists, and all this and all the like. Now, Isaac touches on this, but what he really is interested in his thread is he basically is about motivation. It's all about motivation. He was just saying that, there's three typical pieces of advice that might be given to an artist and writer, and those are write for yourself, write for God, and write for others. And he was saying how these aren't very motivational, they don't really cut to the heart of the matter, and they don't really inspire artists or creators to do anything. And he then ended his piece by saying, well, an actual motivational message would be do art, do creativity, do creation, because you can potentially create something great, and you can rise above the muck and mire, and your name will echo throughout legend. Not his exact words, by the way. Just trying to express the sentiment.
It sounds almost like the sort of thing like Achilles would say. I don't know if you've seen the film Troy, but I think he says something to that effect. Like, I live to do the glorious thing, to have my name remembered, and that's why I do my great warrior deeds. It's that
Well,
sort of motivation he's kind of drawing on here, Isaac, I think.
yeah, I agree. I haven't watched Troy or any of those films, but I've read the Iliad. And in the Iliad,
Yeah.
Achilles is actually conflicted.
Mm.
Achilles, on the one hand, actually knows he's going to die. He knows he's going to die if he continues the siege of Troy. So he's actually conflicted. He sits there and goes, should I live a peaceful life, or should I go and live on in legend? And there's actually a conflict here, which actually plays out like an internal conflict. So it's very interesting in the Iliad to read that. But yes, trying to stay on topic. Yes, I agree that there is that sort of quote unquote. I hate using the word pagan because it has such a negative kind of. I mean this
Yeah.
non-negatively. It's a very pagan sort of attitude.
Would you call it would Nietzschean be a fair description of it as well?
Yeah,
This idea of trying to be the self-actualizing of kind of shaping the world according to your will and vision. In some sense, your art or your story being your expression of your will and having it, rise above everything else, seeking excellence. Is it kind of on that strain as well?
I guess you could. I still need to read. I have a book on I have Nietzsche's on the genealogy of morality at the minute, which I still haven't
Mm,
read. So I might hold off on making a judgment as to whether it's sufficiently Nietzschean or not. But
yeah.
I definitely we could describe it as very Greek. Definitely a very Greek thing. So yeah. Now my issue initially, I asked the question on Twitter. I basically just said, okay, I agree that the suggested motivation is is motivational, right? What young man or woman wouldn't be inspired by that idea? But it's not really possible or plausible in my estimation, particularly because of the way the conservative, this right-wing mainstream conservative money megaplex is like. So I basically said, considering that we don't actually have the conditions for this to be true, what reason or motivation or inspirational message is needed for artists to continue writing and creating in this day and age? And there wasn't really an answer to my question initially. So I decided I would have to give it my own shot. And
But before we get to your shot, then why are the conditions not there?
so basically, it's all about gatekeeping, and it's all I'll describe that from two perspectives, 2 points. Well, I have 2 points. The first one is mainstream film media, publishing, mega conglomerates, and all the mainstream news and media. They're obviously bent politically, and they're bent especially towards the left side of the spectrum. And what this means in practice is if you have axiomatic worldviews, or you have opinions or beliefs or politics which don't gel with their ideology, now you don't get published or considered. And there has been some research to suggest that if you are especially a WASP or a white American, that publishers won't even consider your work, and literary agents will be very, very reluctant to take you on. They're all DIE, diversity, equity, inclusion is a real thing, a real sort of protocol in these institutions, and it's also and to be fair, it's also a protocol and procedure which only selects for the diversity which agrees with them. So you're not going to see. So you wouldn't see another perspective from people who are from non-white backgrounds, for instance. They're going to still select for the ideology as well.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
so from that perspective, it's a no-go if you're not aligned with that ideology or way of thinking or worldview. So that's
When you're making this, like when you're describing this, are we talking here about um, media which is produced for mass consumption? Are we talking about kind of high elite art, or is it both and everything in between?
Well, both really, because
Hmm.
if you look at a little while back on Twitter, people were taking photographs of bookstores in America. I forget what the major American book chain is called now, but they were showing that what was being published on the shelves was about was some awful romantasy stuff about dating a werewolf and being taken by potions, etc. Just like this awful rot and Tommy rot, which was still necessarily ideologically aligned with the publishing houses, etc. And when it comes to high art, well, it depends how you define high art.
Hmm.
Are the things in the postmodern art gallery really high art? I mean, I'm told they are. You're told they are. So even that has an ideological element. I do remember actually being told by a university lecturer or an academic within a university once. I said, well, I'm inspired by Homer. I'm inspired by the Iliad, the Odyssey, and Beowulf. I like writing stuff in that vein. And she told me, oh, be careful. Because obviously she could get her spidey senses were telling her that what I was writing was not going to be ideologically aligned with what academia and the publishing houses like. So in truth, it's both. But that's just one. That's one part of the puzzle here. The second part is that there are no up and coming right wing aligned or just ideologically dissident publishing houses, media companies, etc. There's not enough of them in bulk. Now, some might say, well, what about, for instance, in America, they'll say the Daily Wire. Why not the Daily Wire? Well, the Daily Wire actually isn't particularly interested in reviewing or giving attention to independent authors of quality or writers or creators. They have tried their hand at making stuff, but what they've made is awful, like Mr. Bircham. Like, you watch 10 seconds of it and you realize that this is the most cringeworthy, awful thing in the world. And the people who host these kinds of media platforms, which are like the moneyed, mainstream, right-wing conservative mega complex like platforms, are people like Matt Walsh, who decry video games, say that anime is bad, and just seem to think that a man's purpose in life is to make money, pay and provide for his wife and family, and then sit down and watch paint dry on the wall. Okay, the last bit is facetious. It is just a joke, but this is the caricature people make of Matt Walsh. It is, there's something to it.
It's a good point, because if you take the Renaissance, for example, as a period where you do have a lot of patronage of the arts of very high quality, and led to some of the greatest artworks that have ever been made, both literary and visual. These people, like the Count of Urbino, had a vision of who they were and how they wanted to see the world, and believed that the pursuit of beauty and goodness and truth was worth more than all the money in the world. And so they would spend lots of money on this. We don't have elites who have that kind of vision now. Even if they say they do, deep down it's not there, and it's reflected in the kind of things they are supporting. So I could see your point there about not only is there no mainstream publishers or elite publishers who are going to support this, but even the people who in theory could support let's say right-wing art or something like that, are not really up to the task either.
No, this is a recurring problem which has been discussed a while now. For my New Year's Day article this year, I wrote something about patronage for the arts from this kind of angle. So yes, that's why I say it's not a possibility. Like okay, it's possible. Anything's technically possible. It's just not very plausible, no matter how good you are, that you'll go above the muck and mire and become a great legend in the field of artistry.
I suppose the only, well, not the only way, but maybe the primary way that might be possible is if in a couple of hundred years, you're rediscovered, and like suddenly somebody's like, oh yes, this was actually a great work. Kind of like how in his own lifetime, let's say David Hume wasn't really seen as a great philosopher, kind of a bit out there and not really on the ball. But it was Immanuel Kant who said, actually, no, he's a great philosopher. We need to engage with his ideas, or perhaps even the Renaissance, the rediscovery of certain texts, led to this flowering of art and so on. So that you could say these would be examples, but that's a pretty big if, and putting oneself on the same level as classical authors like Plato is probably unrealistic for most of us.
I'd agree. And the thing is, you don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. So, and also, I'm going back to the motivation point of view. I'm not sure if okay, right, so that maybe your greatness will be discovered in 200 years. I'm not sure how motivational that is. Certainly, it doesn't motivate me. I mean, it's a lovely idea, of course. It is. Now, so basically, I decided to tackle this idea. I pushed back gently on some of Isaac's critiques of the general advice. But by and large, I do agree that's not motivational advice. Like, it's not bad advice to tell someone you should write for yourself, but it's not motivational. No one, and it doesn't give peace. I don't think. I don't think it gives peace of mind. I don't think it helps, even if it's not necessarily bad advice. So basically, this year and the past year, I've been reading samurai texts like the Hagakure and Gorin no Sho, and even the Book of Family Traditions on the Art of War, which is a more obscure one by a samurai called Yu-Gi-Oh! Mananori, if I pronounce that correctly. And basically, I was like, okay, this is a really interesting point of view on life, on warriordom, on the path and way of the warrior. And I just realized that there was maybe a bit more in common with art, that it shared some things in common with art and the way of the artist and being an artist. And basically, my pitch in my original Twitter thread, which I then turned into a Substack just so that I could add a few final thoughts on the topic, is that in the Hagakure, the main piece of advice which catches you off guard is that the samurai writing this suggests that a warrior should live as if he's already dead. He should act as if he's not alive. And that by doing this, he can embrace death and accept death. And if by accepting death, he can better fulfill his role and his task as a warrior. So the actual quote, if I may, is this one. If by setting one's heart right every morning and evening, one is able to live as though his body were already dead, he gains freedom in the way. And by the way, of course, he means the way of the warrior. And he also, interestingly, discusses how death is not shameful. It's actually not bad. It's not like the most awful, hideous thing in the world to die. And he decries people who think that way. And he even goes so far as to say that even if you don't achieve your aim, even if you go into battle and you die, and you don't get vengeance, you don't succeed, etc., you don't win, it's still not shameful. And I think this is an attitude which should be embraced by artists and creators. And this is a philosophy which should be embraced. Because one of the problems I see is that there are plenty of artists and creatives out there who seem to believe that their work is only valuable, good, or worthwhile if it achieves some kind of result. And broadly speaking, the results wanted or desired a cultural impact, make a splash on the cultural scene, influence people, become a talking point around people. And the issue is that if you set this as a goal or as a standard for your art or your work to be good, it has to reach the standard to be good, you'll never find freedom in your creativity. Because you're basically making a rod for your own back and you're beating yourself with it, and then you're beating your art with it. And it's not a good way to judge whether a work of art is any good or not. Because there's so many factors which come into whether something has cultural impacts or not. Anyone can mention great artists whose work was rediscovered, for instance. People are like, oh, actually, this is great. So I'm suggesting that every artist should write and create as if they've already failed to achieve cultural impact, as if obscurity is just a predestined outcome. Because if they do this, it will actually be liberating to accept that actually maybe your work won't ever be talked about, but that you should make it anyway, is actually liberating, and I found it to free my own mind and bring me peace on this topic.
How do you think it has liberated your artistic impulses then? What about that idea of already having failed or already living as if you have died is releasing?
So I'm going to write an article where I'll sort of address this kind of thing about another
Mm,
topic, but I'll try to explain here because I'm trying to get my thoughts together. So the
yeah.
way I would say it's been liberating and freeing, however, is that if you have goals, standards, desires for your work, if you have this desire for your work to achieve the cultural impact, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to afflict you with questioning. You'll afflict yourself with questions. You'll question your work. You'll question your own talent. You'll question everything about it. And the motive will change. The motive won't be you're making art for the sake of art, or you're making it because you have to tell this story, or you have to do this thing. Like this vision that you see in your head must exist. It must be manifested in an artistic form. It deserves to be seen. It deserves to be spoken. That will change if you so desire the cultural impact, or you so desire an other thing. You'll just question whether what you're doing achieves that aim. So if, for instance, you're like, well, I want to make money with my work, let's say. I want to make money. And if I don't make money, then the work's not good and it hasn't achieved its purpose. Every time you, for instance, write, you're going to think, well, is this really going to appeal to the mass market? I know when this plot might be too complicated. Can't I simplify it? Or, oh, no one can relate to that. So I better change the character because nobody will be able to relate to him. You'll do all these things, and then you'll question whether these choices are good, and your artistic integrity and vision will be ameliorated and, beaten down a bit by the fact that you basically have two voices in your head. One which is demanding the vision and demanding that the work be expressed, and the other one which is saying, yes, but what about the market? What about the market? What about the market? And what's worse is when you finish this story and this book, and if it doesn't achieve the financial objective that you wanted, then you've just done it for naught, essentially. You could have made all kinds of changes to your original work to try and make it move the market, make it have an impact on the market, and put some change in your pocket. And then it's all for naught. And then even if you succeed and you make financial impact, a part of you is going to question, well, did I just not question yourself and say, well, didn't I just compromise to make this happen? And basically it turns the process of creation into basically just strife all the way. So it stops being made in the spirit of art or the spirit of joy or the spirit of trying to convey a great truth about reality or your own perspective on things. And instead, it turns into as another spirit it's being made in, the spirit of trying to make something happen. And then, ironically enough, the principle of reverse effort kicks in, where the more you try to get something, it doesn't work. Because you're grasping too much, you want it too much, which is always a bizarre thing, but this is real.
Yeah, it gives you that kind of sense of, oh, if this doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. Because as long as I've made what I wanted to make, or even in that respect, if you're already deeming it that it doesn't, it removes that pressure of feeling, oh, other people are going to judge me for this, or I need to judge myself according to how successful it is. And so in a way it's almost like how would you put it? It's like the bonds of social status, of ambition, of utility are removed, and you can just enjoy it as an end in itself. But if it doesn't come off, then that's okay as well. So it kind of delivers a sort of zero pressure environment to then just develop that artwork quite naturally without other incentives coming into play. So it's not just a motivation; it's actually removing or expunging possible motivations which would have a negative or deleterious influence upon the artwork.
Totally agree. And a thing I learned from reading Gorin no Sho, the Book of Five
Mm.
Rings, is Masashi basically says you should practice and train so that your movements become natural. So you don't have to think about your movements for fighting. And in a sense, when you're constantly thinking, when you constantly have other objectives in your mind when creating art, it's like overthinking your moves in a fist fight. It's not going to end well. You want to create and you want it to be natural. You want it to be as if you're at home doing it. The reason anyone trains in martial arts, and I trained in martial arts for about 5 years, the reason you train is so that the movements are natural. You don't think about footwork, you just do footwork. And that's what you want to be, in that flow state when you're doing art. You don't want to be sat there overthinking it. You just want, obviously art involves thinking, but you do want, because it's a different skill, but you want your thoughts to be clear and your focus to be straight. You don't want to be sat there with 100 different voices in your head just screaming, what about the money? What about the culture war? What about the cultural impact? What about the elites at Harvard? You don't want those voices in your head. You want to, because one thing people criticize a lot nowadays is the lack of authenticity in both art, people, community, and the fakeness which resides. And the only way to be truly authentic with anything is to just create and not be inhibited or hindered by other expectations or values. You sort of need to think about what's best for the work and forget about everything else.
Well, I think that's a great place to bring this conversation to a close. It's a real rallying call for how we should approach art and the way to get the best out of ourselves and manage our own expectations, which I think is a really good thing. In terms of your own work, King Emperor Penguin, is there anything you would like to highlight amongst your vast catalogue of writings?
Well, as advertised in the Literature and Arts catalogue, which is like a sister magazine, I think annual magazine, released by the Corncrakes. My advertised works in that are The Pub on the Other Side of the Forest and my family-friendly trilogy, the High Realm trilogy, which are all advertised, which you can all read and enjoy. They made it into that literary mag, so they must be good, right? And they're all available on Amazon in both paperback and in ebook if you prefer. They're also on Kobo, but no one's bought anything on Kobo yet. So please make my day. Do a first and buy some of these books on Kobo, because that would be great, just so that I could say it happened. If I may, the final thing I'd like to say is, in following the way of the artist, as I like to call it in my thread, you must remember there is no shame in obscurity. There is no shame in defeat. There's only shame in straying from the way.
Well, on that note, I will just say thank you, Mr. Penguin, for coming on this show. It has been a pleasure talking to you again, and much to think on about the way of the artist. I would encourage everybody watching just to go to the corncrakemag.com, where you can read some of Penguin's work and other writers' works. They're really, really good, and it's very much worth your time. Till next time, God bless you all, and we'll see you again soon. Bye for now, everybody. Goodbye.